staring up at the beautiful blue sky, skin like porcelain as the clouds glide by. Her lips parted in a silent awe, barely responding to others when they call. There's something wrong here, though we can't tell what. This is something to fear. She won't make the cut. Everest has sank her claws in, making the mighty weep. For its sleeping beauty, the mountain will keep. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Kayla, and we are here today with a solo episode. I had a completely different story planned, but then some things happened. New developments came about, so I'm hoping to get some more direct answers about the things that I found out were happening, or I'll just say it that way. The things that I found out were happening, and so that got pushed back. And so I'm doing this one kind of last minute. And before we get started on this one, I do have one thing that I want to mention. As with many unsolved stories, there is usually this lasting question that just lasts forever and ever. And there's this hope that eventually those questions will be answered. And that is especially true in my Girl Gone Running series, where there are just so many cases where either there's not enough information for investigators to get solid leads, or there wasn't technology at the time to allow investigators to get solid leads. And now there is. So one of the Girl Gone Running episodes that I did recently, there's an update. End of February information was provided. So there is a update coming for the case on Maria Jane Weidhofer. It has, I believe it's officially solved, though I'm not sure if that's the official stance of it. So I'm going to plan on doing like a mid-season update, because I think there's another episode or maybe two where there's leads and there could be an update coming. But I just wanted to mention that, I'm going to plan on doing periodic updates, so that way anything that has come up since I released the episode can be mentioned and brought up to date. And I'm probably also going to edit the original episode, so that way that information is also in with that, so that way anybody who's new that listens is able to hear that right away. So just as an FYI, that is forthcoming. So today, for this episode, we are going to Mount Everest. And as many can relate to, Mount Everest is one of the most well-known and highly wondered about places in the world. And one of those reasons is due to just how deadly it is. The fatality rate is 6.5 deaths per 100 successful summits, which of course this means that the number is different based on the number of failed attempts each year, and every year this number changes. And there's just so many things that go into the season and the climb, and how successful, or how the success rate looks in terms of, are you really calling it a success if you got your team to the summit but half of them died? Or are you calling it a success if you bailed at last minute but brought everyone down alive? So, there's a lot of politics that go into it. And so we know that Everest is this massive mountain that sits in southern Asia on the border between Nepal and the Tibet Autonomous Region of China. It is part of the Great Himalayan mountain chain that spans from Pakistan to the eastern border of China. Locals know Everest as bear with me. As always, I might pronounce names incorrectly. So locals know Everest as Chomolungma, which means goddess mother of the world or goddess of the valley, or Sagarmatha, which means peak of heaven. The mountain began to form roughly 40 to 50 million years ago when the tectonic plates of the Indian-Australian plate and the Eurasian plate collided. Though this set the foundation for the mountains in motion, the Himalayas didn't start to rise into mountainous terrain until about 25 to 30 million years ago, and their current shape really took effect about 2 million years to 12,000 years ago. So making mountains is a lot of very hard, very concentrated effort, and these plates are continuing to shift, with the Indian-Australian plate being forced underneath the Eurasian plate, and this explains why there are occasionally some massive earthquakes in this area. And not only this, but the global positioning instruments indicate that Everest is actually still growing at a rate of less than an inch per year, but that's still significant because over the course of many years, Everest is continuing to grow higher. But more interestingly is that the mountain is moving a few inches to the northeast every year. Since the first formal attempt in 1922, over 10,000 people have reached the peak of the 29,032 foot or 8,849 meter mountain. They have traversed glaciers, crevasses, steep climbs, and made it through the death zone. As you already likely know, Everest is the tallest peak in the world by over 750 feet or 226 meters. The death zone, which got its name from the high amounts of death that occur as a result from the low amounts of oxygen, which of course this creates numerous problems for people who are in this range. The death zone is above the 8,000 meter or 26,247 foot height. Shaped like a pyramid, Everest has 3 sides or faces that create different routes that you can take to climb to the summit. Each route provides different challenges, and for today's story, we are going to be focusing a little bit on the North Col route. The North Col is the start of the North Ridge where the north face and the west face meet and create this ridge line. This is different than the standard route, which we are generally more familiar with due to the movie of the 1996 disaster. In addition to all of these natural physical challenges of climbing a mountain, you have the risk of high altitude sickness, acute mountain sickness, high altitude pulmonary edema, all 3 of which are fatal conditions that can cause bleeding in either the brain or the lungs, which causes their own sets of problems. Then there is frostbite, exposure, and of course, exhaustion. Temperatures can drop to negative 41 degrees Celsius or negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and storms can pop up from seemingly out of nowhere. Even with all of the best technology on the most experienced climbers, Everest is deadly. And even when you have everything going for you, if something happens, there's really no help coming for you. And this is easily demonstrated by the number of bodies that climbers must ascend past on their way up the mountain. More than 280 people have died climbing Everest, and because most of them occurred on the upper slopes of the mountain, recovery of these bodies is not only expensive, but dangerous and often not done at all. Sometimes because the bodies cannot even be located, and sometimes because it's too dangerous for people to try to maneuver the body down the mountain. And one of these bodies is Sleeping Beauty. On January 18th, 1958, Francis Yarbrough was born in Honolulu, Hawaii to John and Marina. And while Hawaii is a wonderful place to be for many, the mountains of Colorado called to her. Frances went to school for business and received her master's degree, and then as soon as she graduated, she got a job as an accountant in Telluride, Colorado. And this was a great place to feed her adventurous desires, where she would end up starting her climbing passion in her career, she would go on to climb Asia's Goodwill Peak at 5,800 meters or 19,028 feet. She then climbed Annapurna in Nepal at 8,091 meters or 26,545 feet. Alaska's Denali at 20,310 feet or 6,190 meters, and Mount Elbrus in Russia at 5,642 meters or 18,510 feet. It was on her climb on Annapurna in 1991 that she met Sergei Arsentiev. Immediately sparks flew and they got married in 1992. They had a son who they named Paul, and while they loved each other and loved their son, Sergei was a professional climber and a mountaineering pioneer. He climbed all of Russia's peaks over 7,000 meters or 22,965 feet and climbed to all 3 peaks of the Kanchenjunga, which is a feat that only a few people have accomplished still today. And when he was on the climb where he met Francys, he was climbing without oxygen. He was given the nickname the Snow Leopard because of his climbing skills and achievements. It was their meeting that set the rest of their lives in motion. Climbing more and adding more challenges to their climbs, Francys and Sergei were a force in the climbing world. When climbing Mount Elbrus, which is actually in both Russia and European territory, Francys reached the peak and then became the first United States woman to turn around and ski down the slopes. And this wasn't the only first for an American woman that she would accomplish. Next, she set her eyes on Everest and to climb it without supplemental oxygen. The plan was for Francys and Sergei to climb Everest together, and their training began for their May 1998 summit bid, and they would climb without oxygen. They, in fact, were not planning to take any oxygen canisters with them at all. Now, climbing without oxygen is, of course, not unheard of, nor is it uncommon. Many have already reached the peak of Everest and made it back down without the use of oxygen, but as with many things, the lack of supplemental oxygen and the elevation can affect everyone differently. Many who have succeeded have been professional climbers who have lived at higher altitudes for years, if not decades, prior to climbing Everest. Never mind that this is not just oxygen that your body craves in the death zone. You will rely on your teammates, decent weather, good clothing and equipment, solid snow, and, of course, safety measures. All of these little alert systems and preparations that go into the climb to the peak of Everest. And still, when it comes to oxygen, it is noted that without the supplemental canisters, reaching the summit is impossible for some. At 5 miles above the sea level, this should be no surprise. Yet, people have sought after climbing Everest without these life-saving and life-preserving canisters for decades. In 1978, Reinhold Messner and Peter Haneler became the first to accomplish this, and following them, around 400 others have added their names to the rather small list. So if you do the math, this is roughly 4% of climbers who have reached the summit. But what is so hard about climbing without oxygen? Well, not only is there about 60% less oxygen above 26,000 feet or 8,000 meters, but there is also extremely low air pressure, meaning that the oxygen molecules can actually decompress and spread apart. And this is why the zone is referred to as thin air, because the actual oxygen within the air just spreads out and becomes quote unquote more thin. Because all of the muscles in the body, including the lungs and the heart and the brain, all require oxygen to function properly, the lack of oxygen can have lethal effects. Not just including HAPE, haze, or altitude sickness, but also disorientation, confusion, dizziness, headaches, and trouble breathing. It can also affect the heart with palpitations, irregular heartbeats, and in extreme cases, a heart attack. And all of this can come into play because when you are Ascending or descending on steep slopes or narrow ridges, your balance and your ability to keep your wits about you becomes extremely important. Not to mention, again, there's sudden storms, collapsing snow, avalanches, crevasses, and injury from falls can happen all in the blink of an eye. You can be dedicated and respectful. You can be well-trained and perfectly experienced. You can have access to the best team with the best technology, and yet, Everest is never safe. Your life is always at risk. And no one held this closer than Francys. She often told new climbers to, quote, be responsible with their mountaineering and not take their safety for granted. Mountaineering can cost you your entire life, and once that is gone, you cannot get it back. Now, there is a long and detailed history of climbing Everest with and without supplemental oxygen that, we could go into and take hours on. But since this is not the point of the episode, I want to leave you with this. No one climbs Everest lightly. The time and dedication and suffering that each person goes through to climb to the peak, from the idea to the preparation to the execution, it is amazing and astonishing and something that should be acknowledged. And on May 17th, 1998, Francys and Sergei set out to do just that. By the end of the following day, May 18th, they had reached 7,700 meters or 25,262 feet. By the next day, they had entered the death zone and stopped at the camp located at 8,200 meters or 26,902 feet. Here, they ended up staying for an extra day, but on the 20th, the day that they set out onto the mountain again, a storm had rolled in and the snow was heavily blanketing the mountainside. As they went, they both lost their headlamps in the storm and then decided that it was just too dangerous and they turned back. After waiting for the storm to blow through, Francys and Sergei set out again on May 21st, but after 100 meters of climbing, or 328 feet, they had to yet again turn around. And I'm not entirely sure why they had to turn around. I saw multiple sources referencing that they did turn around twice, but the second time they didn't really give an explanation for why they did this. So they had now been in the death zone for 4 days. Again, the longer you stay in this low oxygen zone, the worse effect it can have on the body and the organs, and damage can last longer than just the time you were on the mountain. But finally, on May 22nd, Francys and Sergei set out for their third attempt, and this time they were successful. And with this, Francys became the first woman to climb to Everest's summit without supplemental oxygen. She was joyous, but like many, knew that she was only halfway there. She still had the entire descent, arguably the most dangerous part of the climb, to go. And this is where things changed. Returning to camp, Sergei was met by 5 climbers from Uzbekistan who were on their way up to the summit. They were about 800 meters or 2,600 feet above the camp, and it was about 9:35 a.m. They saw Sergei and immediately recognized him and knew that he and Francys had set out for the summit. But they didn't see Francys anywhere. And when they questioned Sergei, he, a bit confused, responded, "My wife? She didn't come down?" Almost implying that she had been ahead of him in the descent. And what we found out next would imply that this is exactly what happened, and that Sergei wasn't confused at all. The team from Uzbekistan began to help search for Francys and found her. She was still standing, albeit leaning against a rock. She was semi-conscious and had at some point removed her climbing harness, which is an important part of equipment to clip to lines while climbing to help prevent a disastrous fall. The alarming part of this, though, was that she was 100 meters or 328 feet below the camp. She had completely bypassed the camp on her way down. The Uzbekistan team put an oxygen mask on her and immediately started giving her oxygen. She was repeatedly chanting, "Don't leave me. Why are you doing this to me?" And "I am an American." After a while of trying to help her, they found that she could not move on her own, and so the team then retied her to the rope, and then left her. They tried to move her, but nothing they did allowed for her to go anywhere in a safe or controlled manner, and so they were forced to leave her behind. And I do want to note very quickly that even though I had, again, multiple sources that mentioned that she was below camp, I also saw a couple of sources that said that she was located above camp. I'm not sure if the location of the camp has moved over the years, and so people who have passed her actual location are referring to what is current versus what was there in 1998. But I have a little bit of a suspicion that she might have actually been above camp. And this is because there are reports that at 8:40 p.m., Sergei left camp with medicine and oxygen for Francys, and that he ascended to get to her. So again, there's multiple sources saying that she was left below camp, but he went up for her. So either the sources are confused or Sergei was confused. Both are equally likely to have happened. No matter, Sergei left the camp and he was never seen again. Then on May 24th, Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd from the South African team found Francys in the same place that she had been left the previous day by the Uzbekistan team. They noted that her skin was white as milk and completely smooth, indicating severe frostbite. As they tried to help her, she continued to chant, "Don't leave me, and why are you doing this to me?" And in their efforts, they found she, too, fought them. And between the location and the weather, Ian and Kathy were forced to leave Francys where she was. Kathy and Ian had stayed with her for more than an hour trying to figure out what they could do. The temperature had plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius, or -22 degrees Fahrenheit. And they actually stayed with her for so long that they decided to forego their summit attempt that day. But they also had a little bit of extra information that they collected, which might give answer to the lack of Francys's ability to help herself. Kathy believes that Francys might have actually broken her spine and might have been partially paralyzed. This also could have been that she was severely frostbitten and also severely hypothermic, which would have made the control of her own limbs extremely difficult. Kathy and Ian tried to replace her gloves that had come off of her now very swollen hands, but they had no luck as Francys was just complete dead weight at this point. But this also helps us to understand why it might have been so difficult for either team to move Francys from this location. She was just dead weight. And in the upper throes of Everest, there's no room for heroics, because it is those actions that get more killed than necessary. Francys was 40 years old, and between the way she peacefully leaned against the rock and her porcelain skin, she was given the name Sleeping Beauty. On the 1999 Mallory and Irvin research expedition, Sergei's body was finally found. To this day, it is still unknown how he died, though exposure to the elements and prolonged exposure to thin air were likely contributing factors. While the heartbreak that occurred on the mountain is devastating by itself, preteen Paul was home waiting for his parents to return. The day before his parents left, Francys dropped Paul off at school, and he told her that he would never ask her to not leave, because she, and likely he, would regret her not chasing down that goal. But he had a nightmare that night and saw 2 climbers in a complete whiteout. He even stated that the snow looked like it was, quote, buzzing around the 2 climbers like bees. Scared, he called his mom the next day and asked her not to go, but she was adamant. It was just something that she needed to do. For nearly a decade, Francys's body was left where it laid, clipped into the line, and pictures began to surface by those who wanted to take a photo of the famed Sleeping Beauty. But finally, in 2007, Ian Woodall returned to Everest and to Francys to help her. His team wrapped her in an American flag along with a note from her son and moved her body far from where the cameras would be able to see her. away from the climbing route. Her final resting place is unknown out of respect for her family. And this opens the door for another very real conversation that can't not be had when we talk about Everest. The reality is that if you ever, or when you climb Everest, you are going to pass by bodies. Some will be frozen and look like they had just fallen asleep. Some will be bloated or black. Others will clearly have been there for a while, and others will look like they've suffered a severe fall. The many outcomes show a real-life presentation of what you are exposing yourself to as you climb higher. And the reality is that the cost, the time, and the danger involved with bringing a body down to be returned to their family is risky business. Much like the business of Everest itself. Traffic from climbers on Everest have resulted in many more people on the mountain, despite there being a clear message that your life and the summit is not a guarantee. On any given day, there may be several teams trying to reach the summit at the same time, leading to traffic jams on the routes, while in the death zone, long waits in freezing weather, and too many people on a narrow passage. And while everyone tries their best to keep safety their top priority, when you are looking at the dollar signs that it took to get climbers there, making that money, quote unquote, worth it, can take over. For example, in 2019, 11 people died while waiting on the line for the summit due to running out of oxygen. And while technology has allowed for better experience, safer travel, and more accurate predictions of varying weather or other Earth-related circumstances, the truth of the matter is that the more people you have in condensed areas, especially one as dangerous as Everest, the more likely it is that when disaster strikes, more people will lose their lives, more people will be injured, and more resources will be needed to prevent more damage from being done. The perfect example of this is the 2015 earthquake that wiped out an entire village, crumbled buildings all around, destroyed landscapes on the mountain, and killed 19 climbers, Sherpas, and staff at Everest's base camp. You can prepare to the best of your ability, yet you are still not safe. And as humans often do, we seek out our own benefits over the good of the mountain. It is not a question of if, but when the next disaster will strike, and a question of how many lives will be lost. Francys knew this more than most. She had a divine understanding that we seek out the mountains for our own enjoyment, not the other way around. She was resilient and brave, and she was the first to accomplish something no other woman had done. And today, she still stands as an inspiration, as a shining example that women can do these incredible and formidable challenges, and not just that we can go after them, but that we should. And following that, it is women's names that are added to the history books. Everyone, again, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this very quick episode that I threw together today, and come back next week. Bye. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.